awful lot of bits and pieces going now. Slight disclaimer, so at the bottom I've put there that the government return to football guidance hasn't yet been released. So obviously it's been announced that we can return to football from next Monday. However, the return to football guidance from the FA in combination with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has not yet been released. There's obviously reasons for that, which is well above my pay grade, and I know it's not necessarily the FA that are causing that delay, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done so that lots of different sports are going to be announcing their return, what the guidelines look like. So we're a little bit in the dark in some areas, so I apologise in advance. We obviously, when we booked these webinars in a couple of months ago now, we had anticipated the return to football guidance would be here. So we'll tell you what we can, and some of the gaps will have to be left unfilled, unfortunately. But as soon as that return to football guidance document, which we were expecting yesterday, if not last week, hasn't landed in the Surrey FA office yet. But as soon as we receive it, we will pass it on. So all of you hopefully are e-zine subscribers, the 5th official e-zine, or Surrey FA e-zine subscriber, you follow us on social media, etc. As soon as we receive that guidance, we will digest it and send it out within hours of us receiving it. So please don't panic. By the time football returns on Monday next week, or at least for training, most of you in terms of match officials won't be officiating until the following week, so that Easter weekend, and we anticipate Easter weekend being a little bit quieter than usual. So hopefully by the time you have your first matches, that government guideline will definitely be here. So yeah, apologies in advance, but that's obviously completely out of our control. I guess the aims therefore have changed slightly. We can't fill in all the gaps, like I said, but the key thing for us is to help you understand your concerns first and foremost. We can make assumptions as Brent as a match official and us in the office. We think we know what your concerns are, and we know what some of your questions have been, and we're going to try and answer those as we go through where we can. We're going to try and highlight best practice, but that best practice is going to be a little bit of guidance from the previous lockdowns, and when we first got released back in the summer and then the pre-Christmas lockdown. Obviously there was plenty of guidance, but that's ever changing. And it's really a chance for you guys to ask questions. I want to try and keep it to COVID specific where possible. I know there's been a few queries around promotions, and we will answer those things, but we want to keep it to sort of general queries related to COVID. And although promotions will be covered slightly tonight in terms of how COVID's impacted promotions, we don't want to make it all about that necessarily, because there will be some content coming out in the next few weeks about that. So I'd like to start then, and I can't see the chat function as I'm sharing my screen, but I'm just going to start by trying to get some concerns from yourselves. So obviously the pre-questions that we asked were very much around the guidance, but we'd just like to know from you as match officials what your concerns are, because like we said, we can assume, but I think it's wrong for us to do that. So if you could outline what your main concerns are, just in the chat function. If you're completely comfortable with the return of football, then that's fine. You don't need to participate in this next 2 minutes, but it would be useful to listen to the answers and the questions at the very least. So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes. And like I said, Brent, if you can just relay some of the questions to myself, or obviously feel free to answer them as they come in, that would be great. So just a couple of minutes. I'm just going to pause there and let you populate the chat box. And if you feel comfortable, then unmute yourself and ask the question if you wish. Any concerns come through yet, Brent?
The first question we've got is from Barry Harvey, is what is the difference from the previous guidelines?
Okay, so Barry, you've asked the question that as I said at the start, unfortunately, I simply can't answer. The guideline document hasn't been released yet. That is completely out of our control, and it should have been released by now, hence the webinar being put in for tonight. I simply can't answer that question. I wish I could. We know that there will be changes, so it won't be quite as strict. So for example, the previous kind of pre-December, pre-Christmas guidance that came out, there was tiered restrictions. There are not going to be any tiered restrictions, so we know that's going to be the big change. But most, well, I say most, again, I don't know for certain, but a lot of the guidelines probably won't change too much. Some of them will be relaxed a little bit quicker, but other than that, it would be pure speculation, and obviously that's probably wrong for me to do. So yeah, as I said at the start, unfortunately the guidelines haven't been released yet to anyone. No one has seen them outside the government. So yeah, unfortunately I can't answer that one.
Right, next question was from Will Abrahamson. Are there any changes to the parents and how they watch the game?
Yeah, again, it's one of those that obviously I appreciate that. So we've got one of those questions. We try and make our focus on the concerns, but in terms of spectators, at the moment, this first wave, it will be following government guidelines. So how many people that you can meet outside, that will be the main focus. So we expect the guidelines to kind of fall in line with the government guidelines. So none of the FA guidelines and none of the cricket or hockey, whatever it might be, none of those will differ from the key messages that are out from the government. So there'll be a limited number of people allowed on the sideline. They'll be socially distanced, certainly up until step 4 in June, July, when social distancing is expected to be taken away completely, hopefully, fingers crossed. But yeah, there will be a limited number of spectators. Where they stand will be differentiated. And in terms of safeguarding those with disabilities or young people under the age of 18, there will be a certain number of parents, carers, guardians allowed in. But as for adults, we're not sure. And then hopefully step 2, step 3, sort of 12th of April, we're going to go through that in a second. And then in May, hopefully there'll be a greater number of people in terms of spectators allowed. But until that government guidelines are allowed, there won't be mass spectators. But as I say, under 18, we expect there will be maybe one parent allowed to attend, distance from other people.
Right, so that... Sorry, Ash, go on.
No, I was just going to say, any other concerns that are coming through?
Yeah, there's three that are similar. They're all about the policing and the reporting of the breaches of COVID guidance and social distancing.
Okay, well, I think we'll park those ones because we are going to cover those. Again, those are key questions, and that's obviously a concern that people have got is the referee's role. So I'm going to answer that a little bit later because that was one of the many questions that we had that's coming later on. Any others that don't fall into that category, and we can
no, that was the last of the questions.
Okay, all right, fantastic. We're just going to move on, and I will come back to those questions that haven't been answered yet. Now, things to consider. Now, I've had to tweak this slightly in terms of best practice because, again, the guidelines haven't come out. So we've tried to draft this in terms of previous guidelines, and where we're not certain, we haven't put it in because, again, the government guidelines haven't come out yet. But the key thing for me is that the government and FA guidelines, when they are released, so at the moment the government guidelines are out, the FA guidelines in terms of governing grassroots return isn't out yet, but when they are, those must be followed. Okay, so it's not a case of the FA guidelines are going to undermine the government ones. They're done in conjunction with one another. And if you're not sure, if in doubt, follow the government guidance in terms of travel to games, in terms of how far you travel, in terms of restrictions, social distancing, whether you're allowed in or out. You can just follow the government guidelines and the steps, and we'll direct you to where you can if you're in any doubt. And it's really important that we do our bit. If you have had a negative test or you've had the vaccine, whether it's one or both, whatever it might be, it's important that we don't just say, oh, well, you know, I've spoken to such and such team and I know they've had the vaccine and I've had it, so we'll have a drink in the bar afterwards or we'll shake hands before. Cause we can't do that. There will come a point we all need to follow the guidelines in terms of the step-by-step process that we're going to go through shortly, and that was outlined by Boris Johnson back in, I think it's the start of February. So please don't think that just because you've had a test or a vaccine that you are exempt from certain rules, and that goes for anyone that you come into contact with. I'm conscious that people will say, oh, well, I've had the vaccine, so yeah, let's do a little handshake and we can have a goal celebration, we can have a few extra spectators on the side of the pitch. That absolutely can't happen. And I think the key thing here is that as officials, we need to make sure that we look after ourselves first. So that is the appropriate PPE, that is good hygiene, social distancing before, during and after matches. So prior to the matches, we would expect there might be that usual, maybe a handshake, go and have a chat, exchange of cash, that sort of thing that might happen pre or post match. That stuff needs to be really limited in terms of the contact that you have to announce the fact that you've arrived at the venue and that you are the match official. That needs to happen at a distance. Again, if you're going to be outside, then face masks aren't necessary, but protect yourself. Feel free to put a face mask on. That's an individual decision. But good practice of hygiene and hand sanitizer. You can't guarantee that's going to be at some of the venues, depending on the pitch and how far that is from the clubhouse. So practicing good hygiene in terms of taking that with you and being self-sufficient, ideally. We'll touch later around what the venue should be doing, but again, look after yourself first and foremost. And in terms of the match itself, because of the amount of contact that happens, and it's quite fleeting contact in a game, playing football and officiating a game of football is not considered a close contact. So if someone was to contact you and say, at track and trace, for example, you wouldn't be considered a close contact, because that contact is so fleeting and people are not closer than 2 meters for more than a split second apart from a few, corners, free kicks, etc., which we'll touch on later. It's not considered close contact. So please don't think, I've been in contact with someone that's had COVID, or I've been asked to do a test. You're not going to be in that situation. I think one of the things that a number of people have mentioned to us anecdotally, and we've heard through sort of questionnaires and chats on previous webinars back in lockdown, is that there's a feeling that although football can return on the 29th, some people, a lot of clubs and some leagues are sort of backing away from that and saying, well, actually, we're not going to start straight away. We're going to leave it a few more weeks, let a few more vaccines roll out. We shouldn't forget that you don't have to do a certain appointment. So if you are one of a few referees for your club, and people are putting pressure on you because they've got a shortage, there are some clubs that are playing over the Easter weekend because they're so desperate to return. And whilst we understand that people want to return, we wouldn't usually play on Easter Sunday. And there isn't that. There shouldn't be a pressure from external parties, whether that's a club or a league, to make you do appointments. Some of you may officiate at a bit of a higher level, and those leagues have been curtailed, and therefore you may not have matches, and you may be dropping down leagues to go and officiate in places that you're not used to. But don't feel pressured. If you've not been to a venue before, and you contact the venue and say, look, what's the COVID risk assessments that are in place? If they're not willing to provide those for you, then don't go, and there shouldn't be a pressure, and you can contact us to loop us into those. And I mentioned earlier about tiered restrictions. So obviously the message is still stay local. So we shouldn't get that from the government, and remember that the government guidelines are overarching on these. So whilst football can return, and we don't believe that there will be restrictions on how far you can travel across the county to take appointments. And for those of you at working at a certain level, you may be crossing county borders to take up appointments. Well, that's allowed. Just make it a personal decision. So can you pick up a game that's a little bit closer to home to avoid that excessive travel, or avoid travelling to an area where you've not been before, or a venue you don't feel comfortable with, or that you don't know the lay of the land? That's a personal decision, but the guidance will give more detail around where you can travel. But again, it's a personal decision, so don't feel pressured in that situation. And as I just alluded to, making contact, the previous guidance that we had, and that's not going to change this time. The best practice would be that you reach out to the club that have appointed you in advance, or if you're appointed by the league, there's certainly no harm in you going back to the league and saying, can I please have the contact of the secretary or the match secretary for that club, the home club as listed, because I want to reach out and speak to them about their protocols and COVID guidance. That was suggested as best practice, and we'd still ask you to do that. So it might be a little bit more than you're used to, but in order to protect yourself, ask those questions. And if people say, well, we don't have any COVID risk assessments, well, then they certainly should, and you can report that to us, because that's part of their duty. Then don't attend those fixtures, or flag it up with the secretary and say, well, look, can you please give me some better guidance before I commit to travel? But again, don't feel pressured. Changing rooms, likely, I think they're almost certain that changing rooms will be closed, because that's kind of come out from the government guidelines already, although that hasn't been released within the football guidelines specifically. But I think there has been some where changing rooms and indoor space will be closed. I think toilets will be open, but again, personal hygiene, one person in, one person out, those sorts of things are likely to come in place. And there may be slight differences in terms of localised community hubs, and certain venues will have slightly different rules, but changing rooms being closed will almost certainly be in the plan. So again, please be prepared, pack your bag in advance, turn up in your kit. Some of you may be used to not doing that, but you're not going to have that capacity to change. It's going to be straight home afterwards, shower, change at home, etc. Match scenarios, and me and Brent were talking about this before we came on, and the guidelines really, I guess it's, I don't know how me and Brent would necessarily approach this, but I think the key term here is control what you can within the laws of the game and what your usual restrictions are. So just because COVID has happened doesn't mean you as referees and match officials and assistant referees suddenly have to be policing COVID and all the COVID restrictions and the pre and post match and making sure people are sanitising their hands, or are there enough spectators, are they socially distanced? Those things in terms of like control on the side, yes, it's your game and you're the match official, but in terms of COVID, we're not expecting you to police that, and don't feel that you have to. Yes, there might be a quiet word with the two captains. there might be a quiet word with the secretary on arrival or someone that meets and greets you about the concerns that you have. And if you don't feel comfortable taking the lead in that role, then obviously don't officiate that game. But once the game is underway, in terms of policing COVID, your focus needs to be on the game. Post-game, if you want to again raise it with the two captains, raise it with the secretary or the individual that has met you at the facility or is in charge of that facility, fine, raise it with us straight after as well and report incidences that you don't feel comfortable with. I think me and Brent would rather receive lots of emails of people saying, I didn't feel comfortable with this, should I have done this, what's the protocol for X, Y, Z, what does the guidelines say, I thought there was loads of spectators, but there shouldn't have been, what should I have done? We'd rather receive lots of those emails and us be able to come back to you than we don't hear anything. In the same breath, what we don't want to have is people just reporting every single tiny breach. Player didn't wash their hands after going to the toilet. There wasn't hand sanitizer on arrival. Those little tiny things we're not necessarily going to be able to govern, and it's not really within our remit to enforce COVID regulations. COVID regulations are the law within this country at the moment, so we can't enforce those. So we get a lot of reports at the moment of clubs and leagues, or I wouldn't say leagues, sorry. We get reports of clubs or coaches training in the parks and having unsanctioned matches. Again, we can't police that because they're breaking the law. They're not breaking a Surrey FA guideline because they're not our guidelines. So feel free to report whenever you feel it necessary, but just really have a think before you report it in the tiniest little things we're not going to be able to control. But breaches or things you don't feel comfortable with, please do let us know. I'm just going to pause there. In fact, I'm going to do one more slide and I'm going to pause there for questions. In terms of government guidance, and I've asterished it there, it's quite clear that I think most of you will know that these are the earliest possible dates. So things will not be released earlier than this. So indoor facilities reopen, for example, that won't happen prior to the 12th, and it may happen later. But these are the kind of headline pieces from the government guidance that was received initially and the roadmap out of the COVID guidance. These are clearly subject to change, and we will be notifying you through the fifth official e-zine, through social media, through email, and the FA will be contacting you as well when these things change. So you shouldn't miss those things. Obviously, football returns next week in terms of training, and then from the first Saturday, Sunday, maybe even sooner, there might be matches that you're officiating. 12th of April, again, indoor facilities reopen, but that doesn't mean necessarily that things like futsal are going to come back, so indoor sports won't return. So if any of you are futsal referees, we're not expecting futsal to return. There will be small gyms, I think, is included in that one, but that's not going to impact football too much. Step 3 in the return of spectators, I know that was a question that came up. And now this is the guidance from the government website is talking about mass participation. So your Premier Leagues and lower league football and various other sporting events will see a drip feeding of spectators, and that will have an impact on grassroots. So there will be a greater number of people allowed, but again, we don't know how social distancing is going to go. So we can't commit at this stage to say on Monday the 17th, there will be X amount of spectators allowed. That will be subject to change and maybe regionalised, we don't know. And then hopefully from Monday the 21st of June, social distancing will be removed. For those that aren't aware, the football season in England has been extended till the end of June. So although some of you may be thinking, well, 21st of June, the season will be finished by then, actually it won't for some leagues. Although a lot of the leagues are deciding not to continue with league fixtures, they're going to focus on cups and tournaments, friendly fixtures and development fixtures. The season could, in theory, still be going on in June for some leagues that need to finish. So you may be getting appointments at that time, at which point the social distancing rules and regulations may have been relaxed. So it will allay certain fears, but again, we will notify you, and the government will obviously notify you. So keep abreast of the changes. And Brent's going to post in the chat shortly, if he hasn't done so already, the links to the government guidelines and some Sport England guidelines, which has given some further reading, which I suggest you have a look at. The Sport England guidelines goes into a little bit more detail of how sporting arenas and officials might be able to support the return. Brent, I don't know whether we've got any questions in the chat box or anything that I've covered already.
Yeah, there was one from Max Vanderberg. If
Okay.
players have to do a test beforehand and they test negative, how can we make sure that they will not be allowed to play?
Well, if they test positive, do you mean? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a government guideline. So if you test positive, or if you had suspect they're having symptoms. So I guess there's two scenarios there. One would be if they were isolating because they had symptoms, well then they shouldn't be at the game anyway. That's obviously not your responsibility pre-match to organise. If they were, some venues, depending on level, might be doing tests, so the lateral flow test on arrival. Again, if someone's having a test, but it's not because of symptoms, if they test positive, they should go home. In terms of what you do, well, you can't govern that. That's the law. The law states that if you have a positive test, you stay at home. So that's not for you to govern. However, if you were in that situation and you found out someone had tested positive, well, then you'd quite easily be able to say, well, I'm out then. I'm the referee and I'm not happy taking part, and you could head home. The game then wouldn't go ahead. So you kind of do have control, but it's not up to you to say to that person, you must return home or else there's going to be discipline. We wouldn't sanction a discipline reprimand on that individual because, again, that's the law. We don't have any control over COVID breaches. So if it was me, I would step away, get in the car, and I'd head off home and I'd explain my rationale to the players. If they continue to say, well, we want to play, well, yeah, you'd remove yourself in the situation.
Can I jump in there, Ash? As club chairman, I'm fully aware all clubs would have been given guidance from the FA that all clubs must have a COVID officer, and it's the responsibility of that COVID officer to ensure that social distancing and reporting of any incidents relating to COVID is declared. So, for instance, my club, if anyone has any symptoms, they have to declare on a Google spreadsheet to our club that they're unable to attend because of they've been tested and the results have come back saying they have COVID. So we would then stop them from coming to football. If, for instance, a parent brings along that child and we then find out that they have got COVID, then as a club, the club is responsible for stopping that player from participating. As a referee, I would be saying, because I've now heard that certain player has been tested, has come back positive, I won't be starting the game whilst that player is here. And that would be enough for the parents to then just take the child, say, okay, we'll go home, we'll let everyone else play. But it's not something that we would probably come across as referees, because in all honesty, no one would declare that to anyone unless they were completely silly.
And I think, Brent, you made a good point, and I should have added that to the guidelines. The COVID officers are really important. So in your pre-match check with the club, if you're going to do that, and we would suggest that you would, we'd be expecting you to contact or the person who's appointing you, whether it's a league referee, secretary, or whatever it might be. Feel free to ask the question to them: who is the COVID officer at that club? And the COVID officer should be present. If there is an activity taking place at his or her venue and they are the designated COVID officer, then it's likely that they will be in attendance, and their contact details at the very least should be on display when you arrive at those venues. So if you haven't heard and you've decided to go to the game anyway, all of those details should be visible to you. So when we had matches at Meadowbank and I was the COVID officer, my contact details were given out in advance. They were on the front door. There was a briefing done to players in advance to say who the COVID officer was, and those details were exchanged via email. So both clubs should be exchanging communication, and so should you. And I appreciate there's an extra step, but Brent's exactly right. There's someone there that should be taking ownership of the COVID breaches and COVID guidance. Anything else from anyone else?
Will friendly matches be sanctioned by Surrey FA?
Yeah. There was a conversation about this in terms of senior management today, actually, in a meeting that I was in. The honest answer is I don't know. I'd have to come back to you, and we will be providing a guidance document on those. So all matches should be sanctioned by Surrey FA. So everything should be coming through us, because it's in the current season. The sanctioning of a friendly match would be, it's not so much that we're sanctioning each individual match, we're sanctioning the clubs. So if the two clubs are affiliated for this current season, which runs till the 30th of June, if they want to play a match against each other, that game is sanctioned. So the only way you would know or find out if that game wasn't sanctioned would be if one of those clubs' affiliation had been taken away, or they just hadn't affiliated in the first place. So to answer your question, yes, all matches between two affiliated clubs or teams, will be sanctioned. There are going to be an awful lot more friendly or development fixtures going on, so yeah, that they will be sanctioned. Where discipline falls within those, there might be a little bit of a grey area, and we will confirm that at a later date. The next slide is going to cover off a few bits and pieces around key questions. So if I don't answer anything or haven't answered anything, hopefully they'll come up here. So I'm going to go through each of these. If it's a question that you've already asked, then apologies. I also did this in the last 48 hours. So I've taken out some. So if your question specifically isn't in here, it's probably because I had merged it with another question that was fairly similar. Use of changing facilities, well, that's already been provided. No, they won't be open as far as we're aware. I'm almost 100% certain to hang my hat on that one. Goal celebrations. Now, we can only go off the previous guidance because this week's guidance hasn't been released yet. I think previously goal celebrations, it was suggested that they shouldn't happen. I think those of you that officiated will know that they probably did happen, and we're not going to punish people. It's not a yellow card offence. Again, it's a suggested best practice and guidance within the sort of, it's not a law change, so you can't sanction a yellow card for that. But the suggestion would be being sensible with it. So in your brief to the captain at social distance, we'd be reminding them that goal celebrations are not expected, and we shouldn't be seeing those elaborate celebrations, and avoiding that contact and minimising that contact should be key. But in terms of what you're expected to do, it's just a gentle reminder, I think, pre-match. And if it happens in the game, especially if you're involved in a sort of 10-goal thriller and there's lots of celebrations, just reminding those people at those key stages. But what you can do other than that, you can't really govern it above and beyond that with yellow and red cards. Will the guidelines change on key dates in May and June? Yes. So the guidance will change because, as I said, the FA and guidance from Department of Culture, Media and Sport, which is who we're waiting to publish this return to football guidance. Again, we know that sits underneath the umbrella of the government guidelines. So if the government guidelines are changing in May and June, then that will have a filter down effect. So there will be changes, but what they are, we don't know. In terms of promotion, I might just cover promotion in a second. So I'm going to jump back to promotion for next season because I know Brent had an update from the FA today, but I'll cover that one in a second. Referees expected to police outside of the pitch. I've covered that already. No, again, you might put a gentle reminder. It might be speaking to the COVID officers, say, guys, look, come on, we know this isn't supposed to be happening. But again, if you don't feel comfortable starting the game because you think it's a serious breach, alert the COVID officer, speak to the captains, etc. Maximising social distancing on and off the pitch. Like I said, football is not considered close contact, so there is no such thing as social distancing on the pitch in terms of when the game is live. What we would try and ask you to do is, as per the previous guidance, is minimise the amount of time at corners and set plays where possible. Again, if you need to be speaking to a player, administering sin bins, giving out cards, whatever it might be, because something else has happened and it just means you have to get that done. What we don't want you to do is say, right, we've got a maximum of 10 seconds to get a whole corner routine complete. If you need to deal with something, whether it's an infringement in the box, then stop, administer your sanction, whatever it might be, and then step out. But we need to be sensible that we need to be trying to maximise that whenever we possibly can. So trying to limit the amount of time and that people come into close contact is preferred. But again, we can't undermine the rules and laws of the game because that's important as well. And football is not considered close contact, so the government don't see that as being a close contact, as I said earlier. How are you making sure it is COVID safe? Now, I've obviously left that in there because to a certain extent, Surrey FA isn't making sure it's COVID safe because we can't police that. We will provide guidance, we will provide these webinars and give as much information as we possibly can, but it is up to the clubs and the leagues and the individuals, the players and yourselves as match officials to make it COVID safe. We can't do that for you apart from providing the guidance. We can answer queries where we can. If we get reports of COVID breaches, we can try and step in to provide guidance and education to those people that are involved. But in terms of what we can make sure happens, that's all we can control at the moment, I'm afraid. So if everyone follows best practice, then we shouldn't have too many issues. So yeah, I've left that in there deliberately because in terms of what we're doing, we can't enforce certain things. The cash and card question is a good question. So under certain venues, so for example, the referee academy at Chelsea and Fulham, that we appoint match officials to the academy, they have gone cashless as a result of COVID. But in terms of the venue, I mean, you're still very much at grassroots level here, like could even be youth football. So it's very unlikely, unless the club contacts you to say that there is a means to transfer by cash, by like PayPal or online, or feel free to, you could ask that question when you get the appointment, is would it be possible to transfer me the money via PayPal or whatever means you want to use? So feel free to request that. But ultimately, it's very unlikely that, especially in the certain outskirts of Surrey and areas of Surrey, that people are going to have card machines, that the facilities just won't be in place. So it's unlikely, but where you feel comfortable, you can ask that question if you can have it transferred pre-game, or maybe the club has got that in place. So, unfortunately, again, we can't police that, we can't force it. Cash can be exchanged, although it's not best practice in the sort of wider world. In football, it's very difficult to enforce that. The question around grassroots and professional football. So there are stark differences, to be honest with you. Obviously, the return to football guidance has already been published for the professional game. They've been returned for what seems like an awful long time. I think they returned back in July, August last year. There's obviously testing, there's protocols, there's additional medical staff, there's additional training and guidance and scrutiny. So the differences are vast in terms of the referee academy that I just mentioned. By no means professional, but it's in a professional environment and format. So there is testing. So our match officials will get tested by the club doctor on arrival at Chelsea, and at Fulham there'll be a lateral flow test. So in those environments, for those of you that are fortunate enough to take part in that, or maybe have FA Cup appointments, then you will be exposed to a slightly different environment and different protocols, and you'll be told what those protocols will be in advance. But in terms of grassroots, it's just following the guidance that we've already talked about, really, from the previous lockdown, and the guidance that we've gone through over the last few slides. So, there are huge differences, and that's not really necessarily going to change too much. Safety on match day, I think we've probably covered this as much as myself and Brent possibly can. It's being sensible, it's looking after yourself, and if you don't feel comfortable, then as the referee, obviously it's your role and your duty to step back, speak to the COVID officer, and if you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason, you think it's severe enough that the match can't continue or shouldn't even start, more likely, then obviously that's your call to make. But we'd expect you, if you're going to be stopping games or not accepting games when you arrive, just to let us know why, just so we can support you and educate the people that have breached guidelines, basically. Brent, do you want to just quickly jump in on promotion season? So I know the FA, I don't know whether this is being communicated to promotion candidates or wider officials this afternoon, but I know, Brent, you were on a call today about promotions and what the impact is going to be.
Right. The FA did declare a reclassification of the criteria for the promotion scheme this morning. That email went out to all of the 5 to 4s and above. I've emailed out the same reclassification to all our promotion candidates. They would have had that notification around about 2 o'clock this afternoon. But long story short is I've met with the promotion coordinators, and we're looking at each individual case over this week and beginning of next week, and we'll be in touch with all our promotion candidates as to what is the best way forward for them and for us to get through the promotion scheme this year. We are hoping with the reclassification, it's dropped the criteria that we will be able to get everyone through. But like I say, it's going to be an individual case per candidate, hence why we're looking at each person separately so we can decide best route forward for them. So that those candidates have been told today in an email, and there'll be further communication this time next week.
And I think another thing just to add to that, in terms of promotion, obviously there's observers and mentors and referee coaches on things like the academy or the promotion scheme or the development group. So we need to be wary in terms of utilising our workforce. There may be members of the workforce who are maybe older, they're shielding, they're looking after individuals, they've got personal circumstance where they don't want to be deployed. So we are going to have less people in terms of referee workforce, and by that I mean tutors, mentors, etc., observers. We're going to have less people to pick from, so therefore there may be additional restrictions because of people's individual circumstance, and we won't necessarily, and we certainly won't be for the first weekend, sending out loads of members of our referee workforce to go and do mentoring, because we need to bear in mind that COVID is still out there, and some people don't feel comfortable with that, and therefore we'll be doing some additional training with our members of the referee workforce tomorrow night, and we'll be outlining a sort of phased return for people. So it's likely early to mid-April you may start to, if you're on the promotion scheme or development group, you may then start to get contact from those people to say, I can come and observe some matches with you, and there'll be some additional guidance for those relationships and how they're managed and distanced. But we need to be wary of that as well, that even if the promotion scheme can come back and it's full, which it isn't, we also can't just jump and say, right, okay, we're going to send 70 people out this weekend, because that would be the wrong thing to do. Okay. There were some questions that were grouped together a little earlier, which I think I've now covered, but any other questions, Brent, at this stage?
The other questions I've answered in the chat box.
Okay.
If I'm officiating with club officials and they do not have flags, should I give them mine or make them use club equipment?
I think it's a judgment call, isn't it? I mean, my first thing would be, you can kind of try and protect yourself against those events. Sharing of equipment shouldn't happen, basically. That was in the previous guidelines, and we expect that to be in the new guidelines. So under the guidelines, the advice there would be to speak to the club, sanitize that equipment, make sure there's the ability to sanitize that equipment if it hasn't been done already, making sure you're witnessing that sanitization. But really, we wouldn't want that to happen. And again, it comes down to individual roles and responsibilities here. Making sure equipment is packed in advance, that's something that should happen regardless of COVID. But yeah, we really need to, I certainly wouldn't be giving my equipment away, because that would breach the guidelines as the guidelines stood last time. Whether that changes this time, I don't know, but I can't imagine it would change enough to be able to switch equipment, because the government guidelines say you can only sit with people outdoors and you can't have people in your house. So switching of equipment wouldn't seem right either. So I think, yeah, the guidelines are probably going to state that you can't switch equipment. Anything else, and we can then talk about additional, more positive opportunities?
No, that was the last of the questions. The last one, I'm speaking to someone now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll cover that in a second. If anyone's got any more questions, then feel free to unmute yourself. In terms of things that are coming up, so we just wanted to outline some upcoming professional development, so continuous professional development, CPD, in case I reference it and you're not sure what that means. But in terms of CPD and development opportunities, you will all hopefully be aware of the Fifth Official and the other areas of our website that are now dedicated to refereeing development. So this doesn't necessarily apply to you, but it would be great for some promotion and assistance if you've got sons, daughters, friends, family that might be interested. But next week we've got our second free online introduction to refereeing webinar. So if anyone in your family or close friendship group, like I said, or school, or if you're a teacher and you work with people at school, it's a free drop-in next week. It starts at 7 o'clock. They can contact us for the link. So just refereeing@surreyfa.com. We had over 290 people book onto the last webinar. Demand was so high that we've had to put on another one. So it's a free intro. We'll cover some basic laws of the game, get people to watch some videos, sort of have a go at being a referee. We'll introduce the basic referee course in terms of what to expect. And then by signing up to that webinar, they can then get details of the first set of basic referee courses when they return, which we don't have a date for yet. But please feel free to advertise that. As a current official, it would be great to advertise for the new crop of referees that can start this and next season. Things for yourselves, anyone on this call, if you're a match official in Surrey, then all of the remaining things are available to you. So we are running, there's a slight caveat to that, which I'll cover in a second, maintaining positive mental health. So there's going to be a big drive around mental health. You would have seen in the Fifth Official easing the seeking of appointment of a referee mental health champions by the FA. So we have 3 candidates that have gone forward to be interviewed for that role, and they will become Surrey FA's referee mental health champion. They will have a varied, wide-ranging role in terms of supporting refereeing, and will likely come and support our working group and support us in the office. But we have a mental health and well-being session for referees, so it's bespoke to refereeing. It's going to be delivered by Nathan from the 3rd team. So anyone that was part of our showcase event back in December, he presented around resilience for referees. So he's going to deliver a bespoke workshop, completely free. Booking details have already been sent out, but I will ask Brent to post it in the chat box. So if you want to get involved on the 15th of April, I think we start at 7 and we'll run for about 90 minutes, 2 hours max, so you'll be done and you can have the rest of your evening. But a great opportunity to support yourself. And the return of football does bring some anxiety to some people. So if you want to get involved in that, please do book on. Booking's still available, and there's still plenty of spaces on that. Nathan then returns the following Thursday. So for anyone who is part of the development group, So if you're not sure, then I'd suggest that probably means you're not. So there's a group of development group members who get additional support. We're doing a dealing with unexpected incidents on the field of play. Again, Nathan's going to come in and talk about that and link that back to how people have been out of the game for a little while because of COVID and how you can deal with those things. There is going to be some dedicated mental health first aid training for referees. So if you want to get involved in becoming a first aider for mental health, so with young people or adults, again, the date's a bit to be confirmed. At the moment, I'm working off a 3rd or 4th week in April. There'll be a 2-day course and there'll be a half-day course, which will be run in the evenings. They'd, again, opportunity to upskill yourself. That's an official qualification from Mental Health England, which is abbreviated there in the bracket. So that's Mental Health England's an official qualification, signs and symptoms of people that might be struggling with mental health and how you as an individual could deal with that. And then we will be running a bespoke Q&A, a panel as well. We're going to have a panel Q&A in May for Mental Health Awareness Week. So for those of you that are slowly coming out of lockdown and easing, again, anxieties, confidence, people have been inactive, all of these things we're trying to do to support match officials regardless of experience. So please do reach out and get involved in those things once they're available. And there's the logos there. So one on the left for most of you, the 5th official. Please visit our 5th official page for all your development needs. Tonight's webinar will be uploaded there in the next 10 days or so. It'll be sent to you first to view, and then it'll be uploaded onto our website, but the bespoke 5th official page, so you can access podcasts, reading, blogs, and previous recorded webinars. So if you've got any queries or follow-up questions, you can visit the 5th official. Actually, it's a one-stop shop. And you've got the technical area in the clubhouse there as well, which are for coaches and club and league officials if you also wear those hats. Okay,